My father hasn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years, not since the accident. And for 3 years, I did everything I was supposed to do. I moved back into my childhood home. I managed his care. I handled his bills. I watched his face every single morning for any sign that the man I knew was still in there somewhere. And then 4 months ago, I started noticing things that made me question everything I thought I understood about what had happened to him. It started with his hands. My father was an electrician for 31 years. He had rough, calloused hands. Hands that could strip wire in the dark by feel alone. After the accident, his neurologist told us the damage to his motor cortex was significant. That fine motor control in his right hand was likely gone for good. We'd accepted that. We'd grieved that specific loss the way you grieve small things, quietly, without ceremony, folding it into everything else. So when I walked into his room one Tuesday morning and saw his right hand resting on the bedspread with his fingers slightly curled, and beside him on the nightstand, a pen that had rolled to the edge, I thought I was imagining things. The pen had been in the cup on his desk across the room. I told myself the night nurse must have moved it. I put it back and forgot about it. Then it happened again. Different object, same sense of wrongness. The third time, it was his wedding ring. My mother had passed when I was 17. He never took that ring off, not even when he worked. After the accident, it had been put in a small dish on his dresser because his hands had swollen during the first hospitalization and it no longer fit. 3 years sitting in that dish. One morning it was on the windowsill, 7 feet from the dresser, on the other side of his bed. I asked the night nurse, a woman named Agnes. Wait, no, I need to use different names. Her name was. I'll call her what I called her, the night nurse. I asked her directly. She shook her head, said she hadn't touched it. She looked genuinely confused. I believed her. I started paying closer attention after that. My father's name is Leonard. He had his accident on an icy road in February, 3 years ago, coming home from a job site. Single car collision. Truck hit a patch of black ice, went into a culvert. He was found by a passing driver about 40 minutes later. By the time the paramedics got there, he'd been without adequate oxygen long enough that the damage was done. The doctors used a lot of careful clinical language to describe what was left of him. I learned to translate. What they meant was, he's here, but he's not coming back the way you remember him. Except, I started sitting with him longer in the evenings. Not talking, just sitting. And I noticed things I'd stopped noticing because you stop noticing things when you're tired enough and scared enough and grieving enough that you just move through the motions. I noticed that his eyes tracked the television sometimes. I noticed that when I laughed at something, really laughed, not politely, the corner of his mouth would move, not a full expression, a flicker. I told myself it was involuntary, neurological noise, the brain doing random things. His care team had told me this could happen. Don't read into it, they said. Don't torture yourself. So I didn't read into it for another 3 weeks. Then I was on a call with my job. I work remotely, project management, nothing glamorous. And I was sitting in the kitchen with my laptop while I talked, and I had a clear sight line down the hall to his room. His door was open, and I watched my father slowly, deliberately, turn his head toward the window. I ended the call. I walked to his room. I sat down next to him. His head was turned toward the window. Outside was the backyard he'd built a deck in when I was 8. He was staring at it. Dad, I said. Nothing. Dad, can you hear me? His jaw moved, just slightly, like he was trying to form something and couldn't find the muscle memory for it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called his neurologist, a Dr. Carver. No, I'll keep the names of the medical professionals real. Actually, the neurologist had rotated off his case by then. There was a new one assigned to him, a man I'd met once briefly during an insurance review. And there was his at-home therapist, a man named Whitmore who had been coming to the house twice a week for about 8 months. I didn't like Whitmore from the beginning, and I'd told myself that was my problem. He was professional, credentialed. He'd come recommended through the care coordination agency my father's disability coverage had assigned. He was attentive with my father, gentle even, and he kept careful notes that he shared with the team. There was nothing objectively wrong with him. He just had a quality I couldn't name. A kind of stillness that didn't feel like calm. It felt like waiting. About a week after I saw my father turn his head toward the window, I came home earlier than expected from a supply run and found Whitmore still in the house. His scheduled session had ended 40 minutes prior. He was in my father's room, door mostly closed, and I could hear him speaking in a low voice. I stood in the hallway and listened. He was saying, "Not yet. You have to wait. He's not ready to know." I pushed the door open. Whitmore straightened up fast, turned around. His face rearranged itself into something professional in about half a second. My father was in the bed, eyes closed, expression blank. "Sorry," Whitmore said. "I was just finishing some notes, lost track of time." I looked at my father. I looked at Whitmore. I said, "I'll walk you out." I did not confront him then. I wish I could say I was being strategic, but honestly, I was just so shaken I didn't trust my own voice. I walked him to his car. I watched him drive away. I went back inside and sat on the floor of the hallway for a long time. Then I did what I should have done 8 months earlier and looked Whitmore up properly. His credentials checked out on the surface. Licensed, registered, no public disciplinary actions. But the agency that had referred him, I'd assumed it was my father's insurance. When I went back through the paperwork, it wasn't. The referral had come through a third-party coordination service that I'd never heard of, attached to a letter I'd signed in the first weeks after my father came home, when I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to read every document carefully. The agency had a website, 1 page, thin, no reviews, registered 14 months ago. The registered agent's name meant nothing to me. I called my father's original care coordinator, who had since moved to a different company. She'd never heard of the third-party agency. She said the referral should have come through the primary insurer and asked if I had documentation from them directly. I didn't, I'd assumed. I installed cameras that weekend, small ones, the kind that clip to bookshelves. I told myself I was being paranoid. I installed them anyway. 3 days later, I had footage of Whitmore arriving at the house during a session, going through my father's medical file, which he had access to professionally, so that wasn't the thing, but then taking photographs of specific pages with his personal cell phone, pages from the financial power of attorney documentation that my father had set up 2 years before the accident. I sat with that for a full day. Then I called a private investigator who had helped a friend of mine during a custody dispute. I described what I had without showing him the footage yet, and asked if it warranted looking into. He said yes immediately, and I heard something in his tone that made the back of my neck cold. While he worked, I did my own digging. My father had built a small amount of real property over his lifetime. Nothing enormous, but 3 rental units in the town where I grew up and a piece of commercial land on the edge of the county that he'd bought cheap in the 90s and that had quietly appreciated. His estate was not nothing, and because of his condition, his financial affairs were managed through a limited power of attorney that named 2 co-agents, me and a man named Han. And here I have to stop and tell you something I should have told you from the beginning. My father had a business partner, from before I was born. A man I grew up calling uncle, though we weren't related. He drifted away after my mother died and barely attended my father's bedside in the hospital after the accident, which I'd attributed to his own health problems at the time. He was named as co-agent on the power of attorney because my father had trusted him completely for 30 years. I had not thought about him in 8 months. When I looked at the financial records, really looked, with fresh eyes and a specific question in mind, I found a series of small transactions, not large enough to trigger any automatic review. Transfers from one of the rental unit accounts to a management company I didn't recognize. Maintenance invoices that didn't match any work orders I'd approved. And at the bottom of one invoice, a contact name, E. Burridge. E. Burridge, my father's business partner, first name Edmund. I called him. He didn't answer. I called 3 times over 2 days. He didn't answer. I drove to his house, a 40-minute drive I hadn't made in over 2 years, and sat in front of it for a while, and thought about who I was walking toward and what exactly I thought I was going to say. Then my phone rang. It was the PI. Whitmore's license was real, but recently reactivated after a 4-year lapse. a lapse that corresponded exactly to a period during which he had been the subject of a civil suit involving fraudulent medical coordination on behalf of vulnerable adults. The suit had settled confidentially. The license board had issued a warning but not revoked. He had kept a clean record since, or at least one clean enough to pass routine checks. And Edmund Burridge had retained him. I drove home. My hands were steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me. I think when things finally resolve into a shape you can see clearly, even a terrible shape, some part of you stops shaking and just goes still. That night I sat with my father for a long time. The house was quiet. Whitmore wasn't due until Thursday. I turned off the television and just sat in the chair next to his bed and looked at him. Really looked. The way I'd stopped letting myself look because it hurt too much. "Dad," I said, "I know something is wrong. I'm going to fix it." The room was quiet for a long time. Then his hand moved. Slow and effortful, the way you'd move if everything in your body was working against you. He lifted his right hand, the one with the supposed motor damage, about 2 inches off the blanket, and he set it down on top of my hand. I couldn't speak. I just held on. I don't know how long we sat there. Long enough that the light in the room changed. I consulted with an elder law attorney the next morning. I laid out everything: the footage, the financial documents, the PI's findings, the history of Whitmore's license, the connection to Edmund Burridge. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said the words that started to unwind 3 years of careful, invisible wrongdoing. "This is financial exploitation of a protected adult. We have grounds." We filed an emergency motion to review and suspend the power of attorney co-agent arrangement, attaching the evidence as exhibits. The court scheduled a hearing within 2 weeks. My attorney filed a simultaneous complaint with the state licensing board regarding Whitmore. I also had one more conversation to arrange. I drove to Edmund's house on a Wednesday morning, and this time I didn't wait in the car. I knocked on the door. He answered, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face that was almost relief. Like he'd been waiting for this. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. I put my phone on the table between us, recorder running, and I said, "Tell me how long." And he did, slowly at first, then with the speed of someone who has been carrying something too heavy and finally gets to put it down. It had started about a year after the accident, when it became clear that my father's recovery was not going to produce the man he'd been. Edmund had seen an opportunity in the confusion of the early months, in my exhaustion, in the complexity of my father's legal and financial affairs. He had introduced Whitmore through a deliberately obscured referral channel. Whitmore's role was partly legitimate care. He had to be, to maintain access. But it included reporting back to Edmund about my father's condition, specifically about any signs of improvement, and about whether I was paying close attention to the finances. When I'd asked early on about a transaction I didn't recognize, Whitmore had told Edmund. Edmund had told me it was a routine maintenance fee, and I'd accepted it because I was overwhelmed and because I trusted him. I had trusted him for 30 years, the same way my father had. At the hearing, the judge reviewed the financial records, the correspondence the PI had recovered, the footage, and Edmund's recorded admission. His co-agent status was revoked within the hour. Whitmore's license was suspended pending the board's investigation. The funds that had been diverted, not catastrophic but not small, were frozen pending a civil recovery action. My father's neurologist, when I brought him the footage of the hand movement, the head turn, the tracked eye movements, sat with it for a long time. Then, he ordered a new round of imaging and a formal reassessment using updated protocols for covert consciousness. The results came back 2 weeks later. My father is not who he was. The damage from the accident is real. But there's more awareness behind his stillness than anyone had looked for carefully enough. The neurologist used the term minimally conscious state and explained the distinction from what we'd been told before. It meant a different kind of care was possible, a different kind of communication, slow and imperfect and hard-won, but present. It meant he'd been there all 3 years, listening, unable to speak, while a man he loved like a brother quietly dismantled everything he'd built. I think about that a lot. I try not to let it eat me alive, and some days I'm better at that than others. We moved his care entirely. New coordinator, new therapy team, new protocols. I stopped working remotely and found a local position that keeps me closer to home. The house needed some repairs I'd been putting off, and I spent 2 months doing them myself, on weekends, the way my father taught me when I was a kid. There is something in that, in working with your hands on the same house, that I can't fully explain, but that has helped. He said his first word 8 weeks into the new therapy regimen. It was my name. Not clearly. Approximated, effortful, like a man climbing out of a very deep place, one handhold at a time. But unmistakable. His therapist documented it, called me at work, and I had to excuse myself and go sit in my car in the parking structure for about 20 minutes before I could go back upstairs. We're not going to have the conversations I want to have. The road back is partial and slow, and some things are simply gone. I know that. The neurologist has been careful to make sure I know that. But he's there. He was always there. And now, finally, so am I. Is a moment I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom. Not the recording I played for my attorney. Not even the morning my father said my name for the first time in 3 years. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than all of that. It's me, sitting on the floor of a hallway in a house I grew up in, back against the wall, completely alone, trying to figure out how I'd missed it for so long. The honest answer is that I was exhausted, and exhausted people cut corners, not out of laziness but out of survival. I signed documents I didn't read. I accepted referrals I didn't verify. I trusted Edmund because my father had trusted him, and I thought that was enough. That inherited trust was the same as earned trust. It isn't. That's one of the harder things I've had to sit with. What Edmund did was a calculation. He looked at a man who couldn't speak, a son who was stretched too thin, and a set of legal documents with enough complexity to hide small movements in. He wasn't reckless. He was patient. He counted on the fact that grief makes people less vigilant. And he was right. For a while. What he didn't count on was that grief also, eventually, sharpens you. You get tired of being tired. You start paying attention again, not because you've recovered, but because something catches the corner of your eye and won't let go. For me, it was a pen on a nightstand. That's all it took. Something that small, that easy to dismiss, and I didn't dismiss it. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't some extraordinary instinct. It was just that I'd been paying enough attention to know the pen didn't belong there. The small habits of daily care, the ones that felt thankless for 3 years, turned out to be the thing that cracked everything open. Showing up every morning, dressing him carefully, knowing exactly where things were in that room. That consistency wasn't heroic. It was just what the situation required. But it mattered. I think about what it took to unravel what Whitmore and Edmund had built. Not courage, exactly. Though I'd like to believe I had some. It was more like a refusal to let the uncomfortable question go unanswered. Every time I found something that didn't fit, there was a voice in my head that said I was overreacting, that I was sleep-deprived and reading into nothing. Learning to hold that voice lightly, to hear it without obeying it, was its own kind of discipline. And then there's my father. 3 years of awareness behind stillness. 3 years of listening while someone he loved helped himself to what my father had spent a lifetime building. I don't let myself think too long about what that must have been like, but I think about his hand lifting off the blanket. The effort that must have taken. After everything. The accident, the betrayal, the years of silence. He was still reaching. That kind of persistence doesn't have a name I'm fully satisfied with. It's not just resilience. It's something more stubborn than that. Something that refuses to stop being present even when presence costs everything. I'm not the same person I was 4 months ago. I don't think I'm worse for it. I read contracts now. I verify what I'm told. I ask the follow-up question even when it feels rude. And some evenings, I sit with my father while the light changes in the backyard, the one he built when I was 8. And I don't need it to be more than it is. He's there. I'm there. That's enough for today.